Well, welcome to the final episode of Deep Thoughts for Season 6. For those of you who are new, we do 100 episodes per season, and then after that I usually take a break, put out a few bonuses. This year is totally different because of all the disruptions, so I've done tons of bonuses this year, which we're probably going to call the bonus season, and I've held off on episode 600 until I had the time to do the research and what have you. So this is going to be about Stanley Kubrick, as I see him, right? Probably very few of you would actually have any interest in this episode, but he's a very important person to me in terms of influencing storytelling and really just being one of the heightened level of consciousness beings that you can actually see the output from. In celebration of the hexagonal carpet in The Shining, I got a hexagonal cigar box with the hexagonal cigar press. It's the Placentia. Look at this thing. Crazy, right? So I've been hanging on to this for about 2 months to record this episode. It's also the right length for this episode. This will be one of those episodes where I do have a little bit of notes for the earlier parts of his life, excuse me. There's, we have lots of celebrities out there that impress us, right? They do things, we get to see them, and I would say that there's very few celebrities out there, and I don't think Stanley really wanted to be a celebrity, but they had the longest run of most human beings that's ever lived of creating amazing content. So what you see in his films are some of the most brilliant in-camera moments in history, some of the most brilliant interpretations of stories. And the filmmaking, where to put the lens, what type of lens to use, it completely changed the landscape of how we filmed anything moving forward. And I have seen, hundreds of old movies from the 30s up. Brilliant films that were definitely brilliantly put together, brilliantly shot. Not taking away anything from anyone else. But as you'll see, moving through his career, he really did capture something special. So on July 26th, which is one day after my dad's birthday, in 1928, you got Stanley Kubrick being born in, I guess technically Manhattan. But shortly after that, his family moved to the Bronx. And he's technically Jewish. For my money, if you look up the bloodline and what his face looks like, which is very unique, he looks more Albanian to me, more like the John Belushi gene, which is interesting because the Albanians were right in that region, and they're known for creating the theater, for portraying things on stage. So what an amazing multi-millennial bloodline to have come up in the camera and look amazing, right? So he doesn't grow up destitute. His father's is a physician in the West Bronx. But the family apparently, this is just outside information, was brought up without a heavy religious overtone of any kind. Unlike a lot of sort of faux geniuses, Stanley was smart. He was really smart, and the school started to recognize that just the way that he analyzed stuff revealed that he had a exceptional IQ. As a kid, he seems pretty normal. He loves baseball, loved watching the Yankees. He got into chess around 12 years old, which is about the age that most American kids learn that game. But apparently he loved it, too. But his father bought him a camera at 13 years old. And so if you do the math on that, talking about 1941. The camera, it looks like a Mamiya, I believe, but it's a Graflex, Graflex. But he starts to see through a lens. And this was exactly just what his mind was built to do. And I will tell you, having grown up in a family that had a professional photographer, in that the income was often generated by taking photographs, it doesn't matter how much you love to take photographs. Either you have the eye for photographs or you don't. And what's really sad is a lot of people who don't have the eye are massively attracted to the art. And then they They wonder why they just can't kind of get noticed. And then sometimes people have the eye and they have the worst little camera in the world. So Stanley starts to see the world through a lens at 13 years old. This is so huge because then everything starts traveling through the lens. And about this time, televisions are starting to kind of enter households. He has a neighbor, Marvin, who has a dark room. So then they had the full system. You can go buy film, take the pictures. He could take it to his buddy, get it developed, and this allowed him to rapid fire through photography so that he could experiment quicker. And the monetary part, which is definitely a part of buying film and all this other stuff, but it was quicker and easier for him, just in terms of technicalities, right? Now, the other thing, too, is that in his little circle, he had some other great photographers that he was able to tap into. And there's about 3 guys that kind of are around him at the time. So he obsesses in photography. School kind of goes by the wayside. And just like I've always said on the show, a lot of times people do really great in school, not so great in life. Others don't do well in school, but they dominate life. And I think it has to do with left brain, right brain configurations. So by the time Stanley actually graduates high school, he's got a D. Yours truly graduated with that. For various reasons, I didn't give a shit about going to school. 1945, he graduates high school and never really goes out to get any more education. He knows how to do what he wants to do. That same year, he sells Look magazine a little suite of photographs. And so at this tender age of like 17, 18, he gets a contract with Look magazine to do what he does because he's developed his eye from 13 up. So again, it used to be the kids used their teenage years to figure out what they wanted to do. And the only thing they did is they went and engaged and did it. How are all these 80s rockers capable of playing the drums, the guitar, the bass, and sing by the age of 18, get a record contract if they weren't doing it from childhood up, So he gets a little bit of money from this Look magazine sale. Apparently he played chess for money, which I think is awesome because he's still a really young guy and he's beating people in chess and making an income. But shortly after that sale to Look magazine, they actually hire him. I hire him the next year to be a photographer for Look magazine. Fantastic. And at first, the people he worked with thought, okay, this kid is so quiet that he probably is not going to make it because this is a very aggressive world. And that is a very common mistake that people make, is they mistake a reserved nature, which is a sign of intelligence, as weakness. They think more than we do. And so Stanley was a strong kid from a very early age. And of course he did well, but he also was mentored by people at Look magazine, plus his neighborhood. He was hungry for information. He didn't just happen into this situation. He sought out mentorship. He paid attention to previous photographers and looked at the composition and what's making him feel like these photographs are amazing. I'm going through this because this is the foundational sort of spine to everything that led to storytelling as we know Stanley in the modern world. So he he does pretty good. He's doing this for a couple of years. And he is, again, trying to figure out the DNA of pictures. And as he figured it out, he went out and took the pictures in New York, brought it into Look. They get published, and he would see the feedback loop of I did this and everybody cared. I did that and not so much. So by 1948, he's realizing that you can actually composite pictures together and tell a story. So he starts reading books on the subject of filmmaking. He starts watching every movie he can possibly watch. They said that when he would watch a movie, that as soon as the dialogue stopped, he'd pay attention to the film. He'd really look at the composite, how it was actually being told without any words, without any prose. And then as soon as they started talking, he'd pull out a newspaper and start reading. But he got utterly obsessed. And so the first thing he started doing was filming documentaries. So now we're getting into the 50s. of Stanley's career. And I'm just going to tell you, this decade of Stanley's life was the moment when he just explodes. He just absolutely explodes. It's 1951. He does his first documentary called Flying Padre, and it's about a padre who assists people. I think he's a doctor too. And so it's a very clinical shot list of, telling this story, but it's very, very clean. And it's fun. You can go up to YouTube and search on these videos, and they're actually up there. So if you want to see something that's, made by an early master, I don't know about you, but it is comforting to me that the people that you end up revering were actually mortal human beings at some point, and that's you, and that's me. He does another short called Day of the Fight. Now the camera technique's starting to get a little bit better. And then we come up on this anomaly called Fear and Desire. And, it's really strange. Like I've told you guys this before, but I can become someone's, mega fan and not drill backwards into their past, because it's like, well, if they want me to know that, they'll tell me, And this is kind of what happened with this particular investigation. So Fear and Desire is a World War II movie where three guys basically crash behind enemy lines a few miles, but it's very formidable terrain. And so they've used a map to figure out how to follow a river back to where they came from, using the river as cover. But then it doesn't go quite as clear as that. Now, the rumor is that Stanley ended up, after making all of his other films, he ends up getting very embarrassed by this film. Now, he didn't have to dress in the 90s, so I don't think he really knows what embarrassment means. But so I go and search this thing. It's on YouTube. In fact, there's a beautiful copy of it on YouTube. And you watch it, and it's like, okay, the actors show up to work. I mean, there's a few like very edgy scenes that there might be like a 1%, maybe I don't buy the way that line was delivered, but for the most part, it's just fine. And the cinematography, which is obviously Stanley's key attribute, is breathtaking. He ends up lighting the scenes beautifully. He ends up using reflectors in ways that I don't think Hollywood had really figured out how to do it, where he's reflecting light up into the face of the actors to really make them glow. And just brilliant composition. So I think there's different stories about the rumors about him hating this film. Apparently, one set of rumors says that he tried to get every single copy on Earth and destroy it. But there's another story that goes a little bit further than that, saying that after a while, he finally started to realize it was actually okay. Not his favorite work, but was okay. And again, I'll tell you, if you watch any of like the riff tracks kind of movies where you see B movies that are so bad that the only way you'll ever view them, if you don't own the VHS tape, is to watch them through riff tracks where they make fun of the movies. This is hardly a bad movie. So go take a look. He takes a break. He does another documentary called The Seafarers. Again, fairly clinical, but growing, you can see. And then there's three that I haven't seen, and I need to see the third one out of this. But you've got Killer Kiss, The Killing, two killers in a row, and then Paths of Glory. And Paths of Glory is where you have this connection between Kirk Douglas and Stanley Kubrick. Very, very important. Without this film coming into fruition, you don't have this connection between the two men. And that connection led to Stanley being finally chosen as the director for Spartacus, where Kirk Douglas is, the main heartthrob. Now, the inside word on this is that, a bunch of old guys I know who are in and around Hollywood, or at least work with the legends that help make these kind of films, they said that there were several directors that actually passed up on this film, or, they came on board, they spent, one of them spent like 2 months on the project, one of them spent a week on the project. Actors are quitting. It's an amazing production. And this is late 50s with technically a cast of like 10,000 people. And so here comes Stanley Kubrick. He's looking to do something big. I don't know what happened. Somebody, just noticed in him he had this quality, but this is like leaps and bounds beyond anything that he's ever done before. He finishes the film. It wins 5 Academy Awards. First major production out the door. Kirk Douglas is the main actor, and apparently they had a falling out to the point where he wouldn't work with Stanley anymore, which is obviously sad because it reflects poorly on the Douglas family. Then he does a film, Lolita, the famous story of Lolita. It's like an 88-day shoot, $2 million budget. It's heavily censored due to the fact that the script has a 12-year-old sleeping with an older man. So it's got that child thing going on. Now, this is, again, a story in a time when that was the way the world operated. And so trying to be true to it is one way to look at it, right? Trying to be true to history. And then we have one of the very first amazing movies that everyone knows if you're a Kubrick fan. Like, I grew up a Kubrick fan from 2001 up. My father never showed me for a really long time this next film, which is called Dr. Strangelove, which is apparently written by a man named Peter George. And they cast the famous Peter Sellers in it. It has Slim Pickens in it too. George C. Scott, I believe. So this film is now going off in a direction that he's never gone before. Satire. Brilliant satire. And of course, it's one thing to conceive of a joke in your house and write it down on paper. It's another thing to have it be so powerful that when read off the paper, the tone and the quality of the joke survives in performance. Even just survives in someone else's brain. So this script was absolutely brilliantly written. It's about a potential World War III situation. And so you have like this wheelchair-bound Dr. Strangelove, who's sort of the advisor to the government and the military. You have this George C. Scott character that is trying to instigate World War III with nuclear bombs. And it's showing the utter absurdity of government at a time when I think most of the world was starting to realize that they get manipulated by their governments. This was no mystery 200 years before, but we had kind of gotten so comfortable with life that it was like government is ubiquitous to nature, and then we just live in it. And of course, the Vietnam War is getting underway, and here comes a film that's spot on, showing the lunacy of the warmongering generals, the saving face, cover your ass politicians. But the film's in black and white. It'll be the last black and white production that Stanley Kubrick ever films. And of course, he could have filmed it in color, but didn't. It also has a little James Earl Jones in there too, for you trivia buffs. Now, what's interesting about Dr. Strangelove is that at the upper level of filmmaking and the intellectuals of the world, they understood the masterpiece that had just been created. And of course, it's a combination of an amazing writer with an amazing director and a star-studded cast. If it weren't for Spartacus, in my opinion, winning 6 Oscars, you don't necessarily have that knee-jerk reaction for Peter Sellers and George C. Scott and all these amazing individuals joining your film. But that was exactly the seed that got us going. Now, at this point, people are interested in Kubrick now, and the public. They want to interview the guy. They want to talk to him. And so what they end up doing is, of course, and this is per his own admission later in life, apparently in interviews, he took a lot of interviews. There's a lot of audio interviews of him. But he absolutely hated talking to the press eventually, because whatever the guy would say, they would amplify it. They'd amplify his religious beliefs when he didn't really have any feelings strongly one way or the other. They'd amplify any little opinion to try and make this guy something that he wasn't. And so this begins his conscious awareness that talking to the press is a very dangerous thing. So now we move into the very, very famous 2001 A Space Odyssey, written by Arthur C. Clarke. Now, I have heard numerous stories, and I have actually witnessed the Wikipedia pages on this getting modified and then not being able to find the history of the modifications. The initial story I read in a complete detail, and it was like something that I would never make up in a million years. Like, what do I care how this thing came together? Was that Arthur C. Clarke wanted to create a television series and actually pitched it to Stanley as a television series. And Stanley's like, I'm silver screen. I don't do TV shows. He's like, fine, let's just do it as a movie then. The script isn't written. The book isn't finished. And they managed to acquire, I think it was like $11 to $15 million to make 2001 in Great Britain. Now, if you're watching this video, I can almost be assured that you guys have seen this film. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a very profound film, and it allows the human being to do things on a dimension that they're not even aware of it. Your layman says, "Oh man, that movie's boring. Took forever to watch." They felt it was boring. Anyone who thinks 2001: A Space Odyssey is boring is not on board with what Stanley's trying to do in this film. The movie is, of course, going in 3 stages. It has a Dawn of Man experience showing primitive man and how man was influenced by an alien machine that basically upgraded the DNA/brain neural net of how to survive on planet Earth and how to dominate by eating better, eating meat. Then the second stage is you have a crew on the moon that has now found that device several million years in the future, buried just below the surface of the moon, basically saying, hey, if you can make it here and dig and find this, then we're at the next stage where I need to take you to the next level. The monolith then disappears from the moon and ends up floating in orbit around Jupiter. So they build a ship called the Odyssey, which is the one that is at the beginning of this show. And a whole crew of people are put in stasis, and 2 guys are Dave and Frank. They're on the ship with this computer called the HAL 9000. It's in charge of all logistics. And they shoot out to Jupiter. 2 guys are going to remain awake. And then they have some things happen to them. And the ending has more things that happen. Okay? The movie is filmed in a way that portrays the future in an extremely realistic science fiction way and not a science fantasy way. Star Wars is science fantasy. Things that we haven't figured out how we would ever make those things work. You can just make a ship turn around and fly away, right? Like the Millennium Falcon. Doug Trumbull is the special effects guru who cuts his teeth on this film. NASA's involved. Everyone who could make something amazing happen is involved. It's a mixture of, almost real-life models, or I say 1:1 scale models. It has the best 35mm photography, special effects. But the movie is there to put you in a mood of exactly the scenario that you're viewing. So there's not a single part of the film that isn't trying to make you feel like you're with the prehistoric man at the beginning. That you're on the vehicle that's going to the wheel in space before going to the moon base. Eating a sandwich in a little transport vehicle that takes them from the moon base over to where the monolith is. The scenes are exhaustively detailed. Any model, any special effect is completely and utterly meticulously crafted. And just in case someone hasn't seen it, I have to lay off the third section. But just understand, it was to put you 100% in the eyes of anyone that was involved in any one of the scenes in the film. The establishing shot, which has been around for many years before 2001: A Space Odyssey, was given an upgrade, which was to say, I want you to stare at this environment to understand where you are. The sound, the color, the lighting, everything, the music is there to put your consciousness in the state that you need to be. And because I'm asking you to look at this frame for an extended period of time as something occurs, I'm going to make this a painting of absolute perfection so that you're willing to see the scene for a longer amount of time. It was a trade-off. You want to look at something for a long time? No, but what if I make it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? Well, okay. That sounds like a fair deal, and that's the deal you get in that film. The film comes out, and of course, your higher IQ, higher vibration people get it, and they're just absolutely blown away from day one. They go back and see it 100 times. And I think a smaller portion of society, and especially critics that were used to seeing Elvis, Honolulu movies, just absolutely didn't get it whatsoever. They were already in the short attention span theater version of filmmaking. Plus, around this time, the movie was released in '68. Takes, I think, a good 3 years to make. You have indie movies starting to come out. People with just 16mm cameras shooting anything. Low-budget films are starting to come out. Now, in terms of, Stanley being involved in any moon mission thing, I will tell you that he was at home with his family, watching it on TV just like the rest of the world. His every move in the world is tracked by his family. So if he was away doing something for the United States military or something, then his family would have been living there because he took his family everywhere he went. And so, did they steal from his techniques? Did they use the special effects they had developed in the movie 2001 to create methodologies in camera? Absolutely, I think. Absolutely. I think this thing was funded to exacerbate up a Doug Trumbull to be able to create these scenes. Now, for anyone who's ever seen the Stanley Kubrick confession tape, quote unquote, you have to understand that in that video, they talk about an event that happened in 2003, 4 years after Stanley died. So if you need one thing that makes you understand that that's a forgery, and believe me, it's a good forgery. I don't know who that guy is in the camera. The only caveat to that is that maybe the audio of the director guy was dubbed on top of these confession tapes to give the wrong impression. I haven't seen them since they came out, but I believe that the actor who is playing Stanley talks back about Bart Sibrel being punched in the face by Buzz Aldrin, which again happened 4 years after he died. So those tapes have to be forgeries. I know it's exciting to think that happened, but believe me, I don't think they're real. So now the indie thing is starting to come around. Big filmmaking was on the chopping block on Variety magazine and a bunch of other entertainment things. Could Hollywood still survive making really expensive films? Now Stanley, being a scrapper from from the Bronx, he's like, yeah, I spend the money if I've got it, but I can definitely make a cheaper film. And so he sets out to make a film based on a book called A Clockwork Orange. A guy named Anthony Burgess wrote this book, and he said he got the name by listening to two old men talk at a bar, and they were talking about something, and one of the old guys said, well, that's as queer as A Clockwork Orange. And so it's about a group of gangsters who call themselves Droogies. It mixes Russian speech and dialect into English. It's kind of near future, not quite apocalyptic, but definitely the world it's changed quite a bit. And they leave it to your imagination. But these kids go out at night and they wreak havoc on society. They steal, they rape, they eventually kill. And then Alex, played by Malcolm McDowell, ends up going to jail and getting a technique on him called the Levico technique, where they try to condition him against violence and sexual violence and violence of all natures. Now, this film was Stanley's attempt and quite successful venture into creating more of a indie type film with very little effects. I mean, here he comes from 2001: A Space Odyssey, where there's not a scene that doesn't have a special effect. You have actresses that played the flight attendants in 2001 in the middle section, having to sit fully costumed, wrapped in plastic, so nothing touches their white outfits, including their hats, which were handmade, and sit there all day, only to be told at the end of the day they didn't get their shoot today because he's busy doing reshoots of something else. But as it said, the Clockwork Orange script is actually put together with the paperback books. He hands out the books and starts ad-libbing this thing together. Now, before I go too deep into this, if you're really interested in all of the super-duper details of each one of the movies, there is a channel on YouTube called Cinema Tyler, and he does one of the most exhaustive analyses of each one of the films of Kubrick. He loves Stanley in a way that is very mature, and I think that if you really want to get all those super details, that's where you go. But what's interesting about Clockwork Orange is you have Stanley exposing a side of himself that he is willing to direct, which is massive violence, for the time especially. I mean, there's a scene where a woman basically gets raped, okay? And there's no contact or anything like today. I mean, they're definitely messing with her, but it shows you it's starting to reveal the very expanse of Stanley's mind. That he's got the satire of, World War III. He's got this unbelievably scientific mind that can grasp 2001, plus the super spiritual side of 2001. And now, I'm sure that growing up in New York exposed him to elements of the world that, even though he didn't participate in those elements, you hear about stories, and he's running around at 18 years old to 20 years old taking photographs for Look magazine. He is seeing all kinds of different walks of life, and now this film is a fantasy amplification of what could be in sort of a near Orwellian world. But the film is absolutely gorgeous again. The soundtrack by Wendy Carlos is nothing shy of landmark. The movie's got its humor. It has its cast went on to all, if they weren't already legends, they went off to become legends. And if you want to have a fun exploration, just go to the cast and click into it and see where everybody went. But now here's the rub with this film. It comes out. Of course, people are utterly blown away because it's like nothing anyone's ever seen. Again. But it's a much... You said that. But the film is so intense, okay, that it starts getting attacked. It starts getting attacked in the UK big time. There's now death threats coming in to Kubrick and family. And so he's got a problem on his hands. They actually pull it for a little while in the UK. He's on the set of his next film called Barry Lyndon. And he's got to make, little changes in his life because he's got to protect his family and what have you. And this is all above board stuff. I mean, in terms of society now knowing this and his family publicly admitting it on his wife's side. Barry Lyndon goes into a clinical historical film. It is a very long film. It is based off of painstakingly recreating scenes in the film that are based on paintings of the era. The costumes are meticulously put together. But it is one of the most unsung scripts / films of his entire career. Like, you can talk to a Kubrick fan, and most people haven't seen Barry Lyndon. I'm not a big fan of Ryan O'Neal. I think his daughter all but admitted that there were issues between the two of them that are only being revealed to this day by society trying to stop a certain activity occurring. So I try not to blame anyone else for that situation. But the film was grueling to film. They filmed most of it in Ireland. And you have the KLA, or not the KLA, the IRA doing their thing. So it was a tough time in history to be filming that. Now, the only interesting piece of trivia about this film for me, besides its absolute production value, is that Stanley wrote NASA and asked for a special lens to film the low lighting scenes in the film. They could light a room with just a candle. And so one of the links to the conspiracy of the moon landings is that how did Stanley know that this camera lens was made? Now, there are some avenues that he could have known about this lens through just, connections, because the fact that they created a lens supposedly to film low lighting scenes, I think, was actually revealed to the public without talking about who you would contact, what the lens is comprised of, that sort of thing. So he may have found out about that and asked for the lens. But there's a video online that basically says that his wife, in digging around his office, found a letter that had a top secret header on it from Richard Nixon that essentially said, for your duty to your country, we gladly loan you this lens. Now, that being confirmed is unconfirmable without actually someone producing it from the family and showing it to us again. But now you have this next generation of filmmaking that's coming up, the 70s. The 70s is debuting literally everything satanic, right? All these movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Exorcist, scary movies are the thing. There's an up-and-coming writer named Stephen King who writes a movie about a gentleman who takes a job at a hotel, supposedly in Colorado in the book, obviously. The real one in the film is in Oregon, and the name of the hotel is in Colorado. It's called the Overlook Hotel. But a guy named Jack Torrance takes the job. He's a writer who's out of work. He's looking for a place to hunker down with his family, his wife and his son. And things don't turn out the way that everybody thinks it's going to turn out, right? A little bit of cabin fever syndrome comes in there. And, of course, there's twist after twist after twist in this, right? This is where we get several things to occur. It is now going to be de facto a mainstream movie by Stanley Kubrick. Do I think he intended to do that? Probably not. But it's going to make that occur. Stephen King eventually comes out, and he's all butthurt about the way the film was interpreted from his book. He tries to make a TV series correcting the issue, which was so utterly laughable it only confirmed that Kubrick distilled out of the book that which was important. The cast is star-studded. Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Scatman Crothers. Unbelievable cast. And this is where we have a very, very famous scene, hence the cigar shape, where the film has now been sort of earmarked as the film where Stanley tries to send the coded message out to the world that he participated in at least the Apollo 11 moon missions. Now, there's two things that could be occurring there, which is, one, he knew that the moon missions were fake, and he was simply trying to tell the world that these were filmed. He having maybe indirectly participated in the R&D using 2001. Now, there are people that will swear up and down he was involved in this. Again, the only problem is that for medical reasons, okay, his family had to be together during the time that this moon thing would have occurred. And so there would have been memories of being in America, and Stanley didn't like flying in planes. He always took boats. And so that would have been a completely different experience for family members. They would have been staying supposedly in Nevada somewhere, filming things. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter how much you tell the people who want to believe that stuff or have been told that he was in a different location. Kids wouldn't have gone to school in areas. Stanley always made sure he came home for dinner. And so Daddy would have been gone for a very long time had any of this occurred. And then they try to rebrand it that everything actually happened in England. So I don't know if the government in filming that kind of thing would be willing to take all the assets over to a foreign country and fake the moon missions in a foreign country. Seems like you could get caught doing such a thing, right? But the situation in The Shining is that people have definitely looked at some interesting things. And it's a fun conspiracy, man. It is super fun. And again, he may have been trying to tell people something about being indirectly involved. But it starts off with, you know, the yellow VW bug at the beginning, which is an homage supposedly to Gus Grissom saying that this whole project was a lemon. We do believe that he was assassinated along with his two buddies with cyanide. That's what the official report says. They flooded their suits with cyanide, then burned up the cabin with an explosive bolt door right to his left that he could have opened at any point in time had a fire broken out in that cabin. Fire doesn't instantaneously kill you when you're in a spacesuit with the helmet on, right? So the Native American art on the wall is very rocket looking. And I have to say, I grew up in Native American land here in America, and I've never seen that before or since. And when I heard about that conspiracy, I went off and looked up all the Native American rugs that are dated in the 1800s. And I can't find any patterns that look like that, but maybe there's some tribe out there that does that. The entire Overlook Hotel's interior was built in a studio. Then, of course, there's the very, very famous scene where Danny is playing with some toys, some Hot Wheels on a hexagonal carpet, and a tennis ball rolls up. He knows there's a room up the hallway he's not supposed to go to, room 237. He stands up from this hexagonal carpet, which is, you know, the shape of a launch pad at NASA for the Saturn V. On his chest is the Saturn V with the words Apollo 11 at the bottom. He then walks up to room 237, which the theory is that he's traveling the average distance in miles, and thousands of miles, to this moon. The key is, if you rearrange the letters, could say moon room, supposedly. And he goes inside and something bad happens to him, which is, they say, is an effigy to what happened to Stanley as he got involved with this project. Now, there's been some recent corrections to the claims about this, but, you know, I managed to make friends with one of his daughters, and she said that she was in the room when the woman who knitted the sweater was trying to figure out what to knit, and her boyfriend simply said, because this woman was from Italy, apparently, and she's like, I don't know what American kids wear. What do they wear? And her boyfriend simply said, hey man, they just went to the moon. Just make some rocket things, a moon thing. And so she knits it based on that. Now, the carpet design was initially claimed to have been made by the art director. And what he did was apparently knock off the famous pattern that was made in the 60s and claimed it as his own, apparently. But that pattern was not made on set. That pattern was a very, very famous one made in the mid-60s. So I understand people leaning on that heavily. It, you know, maybe through some other chain of events that we cannot piece together, given that the family did not travel to the United States during any production of moon mission stuff. The only thing that Stanley ever did is in April of '68, he took a short 3-week promo over to the United States to promote the movie 2001, but the whole family went together and traveled on a boat. So all their passports have the same stamps on them. In fact, there was one night where Stanley did not come home for dinner. He had to do a meeting, and I believe the family was living in New York at the time, and one of his daughters woke up and said, "Where's Daddy? Where's Daddy?" And she was angry that he didn't come home for dinner. That's how sensitive the issue of him being at home for dinner really was. But that film put Stanley on the map for the average citizen of the world. The soundtrack's phenomenal. The cinematography is beautiful, and he lays off a little bit of the more pragmatic establishing shots that he would hold for multiple seconds. This time he's doing the establishing shots, but he's moving things along a little quicker. The movie blows up. It's 1979. And I've noticed that when you look at the debut dates of movies, you will have a discrepancy between, like Wikipedia might say 79 and IMDb might say 1980. So there's definitely arguments between services about exactly what year. I watch tons of B movies and old movies, and they're always arguing by 1 year. It's the strangest thing. Can't you guys figure out when the movie came out? But now we have a director who has put together Dr. Strangelove, 2001, Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, and now The Shining, all from his brain trust. Remember, Spartacus was something that he took over. Lolita never really got any play. And so you tend to think that, you know, like Spielberg or Lucas, these guys try to make as many movies as they possibly can because they know that there's a limited amount of time in their life. And so they'll create doozies every once in a while, right? Lucas goes off and does Howard the Duck. Total fail. Then he does Willow. Total fail. So quantity over quality is something that you tend to appreciate the older that you get. And Stanley managed to keep that in check. And again, we're going to get to his last movie in a couple movies here, but he absolutely positively invested the right amount of time to get the movie that he wanted to make out the door. So Stanley bumps into a novel called The Short Timers. And I haven't read it, so I'm not sure exactly what part of the film this covers, but the next project he's going to release is called Full Metal Jacket. Now, it should be said that from Dr. Strangelove, minus Barry Lyndon, all the way up to this point, each film has inserted into society sayings that the people start echoing in society to make jokes. Like with the 2001, it was imitating HAL 9000, Talking to Dave, Singing Daisy. In Clockwork Orange, it's 100 different things, saying right, right, right. Vidi well. A little bit of the old in-out. A little bit of the ultra-violence. All these little sayings. From The Shining, you have 100 things that Jack Nicholson said to Wendy. And here comes Full Metal Jacket with a whole nother line, a whole nother world of soldiers going to basic training at the beginning of the film, about approximately 50% of the film, and then running off to Vietnam and reuniting in part with some of their alumni from basic training. However, the utter grit of this film, and I was living in fact, I just finished pretty much living on bases for a good chunk of my childhood, and so just the grit of this world resonated with the world I had just come from when this movie had come out. But the basic training is run by a guy named Gunny Sargent, who was just a consultant on the film. And he'd been in some other things before. And they'd actually hired a different actor to be Gunny Sargent, who they put in a hotel for almost 2 years, practicing to be this role, who ended up being the helicopter pilot shooting people out of the side of the helicopter. But at some point, the Gunny Sargent guy comes to Kubrick and basically says, you know, I think I would really like to play this role. I just feel like it's exactly who I am. And he's a former drill sergeant. And just tight as hell at the time. So Stanley agrees, and the movie's off to create one of the most incredible first acts / second acts of a 4-act system that you've ever seen in your life. Of course, I'm going to let you see it. If you've already seen it, you know everything about it. The only thing I will mention is that the helicopter scene, apparently, with the guy that was supposed to be Gunny Sargent, as he's talking about shooting Viet Cong out the window, when they asked the veterans after viewing the film which scenes were, you know, was this realistic, which scenes were your favorite scenes, it is said that the majority of everyone who walked out of the film who was in Vietnam said, you know, it's the helicopter scene that got me. That's the way we turned into animals at the time. It's the most realistic portrayal of the insanity of this war. So it's an interesting homage to the guy that got clipped. He did such a good job with a tiny, tiny line, or set of lines, that he was very memorable to those who it mattered most to. But the other little factoid about this is that for the very first time, Stanley went to his daughter Vivian and said, "Hey, I think you should do the soundtrack for this movie." Which, if you study Stanley's life and his commitment to perfection, asking his daughter to score the film, who had never scored a film before, to my knowledge, was something that he just saw into her soul that she could pull this off. Because there was no way that he was going to risk all this work for a childish, unprofessional soundtrack. And what Vivian did on this film, in my opinion, was one of the most brilliant music scores to any movie I've ever seen in my freaking life. When you especially look at how, well, you have to feel how the music makes you feel per scene, and then step back from that as a director and say, what's the logic in this? Would anyone with all the Pavlovian training of film scores prior to this point, minus a few like Planet of the Apes, and obviously 2001's methodology was revolutionary, but Stanley was always looking for something new. To this day, I don't really know what he could have heard from Vivian prior to picking her for it, but she nails this situation. And apparently the last recording session, when they really, the film is in the can and they're just waiting for the soundtrack to get it out the door, there was a just grueling 45-day push to get every scene dialed in. And they did it. They did an amazing, amazing job. It makes you feel the visceral nature of scenes. In the first act where they're showing you the basic training, she did some music that was sort of like marchy kind of music, but it also had a sort of a quirkiness to it, which was the fact that you've got random people in a basic training situation. They all come from different walks of life, and this Gunny Sergeant guy, his job is to get them all to be deadly fighting machines so they don't die the second they get deployed. And so the music echoed all of that chaos becoming order. And then, of course, if you remember the last scene of the film, I'll let everybody see if they haven't seen it, just the visceral nature of the music. I mean, visceral is exactly the sound that's happening. It was hardcore, as they say. So now we get into the last decade of his life, which was the 90s. Obviously, he was taken from us too soon, by whatever means that happened. Now, he's always been working on lots of different projects, and there were times when he was trying to put together a Holocaust video, a movie, and of course Schindler's List comes out, and he's like, "Man, I'm not going to be second in this genre." So as basically the pieces and parts of that project were sort of echoed between people, the inside story, true or false, is up to anybody, that he basically pulled out because that genre had already been conquered. And that makes complete sense to me. But he was working on at least 2 projects at the time of his death. Obviously, the last movie he made called Eyes Wide Shut, and the movie that ended up being AI. Now, he died at 70 years old, which by any standard is a early departure for any life expectancy in the modern world. Now, Eyes Wide Shut for me is a very tough film for me to completely understand, because Stanley was quoted as saying that this was the finest work he'd ever done in his entire life. I have friends of mine that believe wholeheartedly, without being told that that's what he said, that they think it's his best work he's ever done. It is a beautiful film. It's beautiful visually. It definitely puts you in those situations where you feel creepy, man, when it's about a businessman who is having problems with his wife, and he ends up just kind of going on a little like midlife crisis escapade and finding himself at a party that's one of those sort of deep state parties where everyone's wearing masks, and he ends up making some mistakes because they trick him to try to see if he really does belong there or not. And he falls for a trick. And then things get even crazier. The film has an empirical value to society in that it exposed that these people exist, that these rituals exist. Now, obviously, he would not have been able to portray what has been rumored to go on in some of these parties because it would be too hardcore for any viewing audience and no one would ever release the film. The other thing is that Stanley always negotiated his contract, as I understand it, to have final cut. Whenever he said was the final cut, they had to release that film. But unfortunately, he passes away before final cut is complete. And a married in-law who he had kind of brought into the production for several years, for 20 years, was given the job to go ahead and perform the final cut, who then surrendered it to the studios because he didn't have that skill set. And we will never know what the final movie, what Stanley's final movie would ever look like. So there might have been elements to the film that made Stanley say this is the finest film he's ever done that we never saw. For me, Tom Cruise was tough to see in a Stanley Kubrick movie because unlike Jack Nicholson, who comes with that creepy portfolio of capability, Tom was performing outside of any envelope that we know Tom as. No fault of his own, of course. And there's scenes that he does great, but he's sort of Tom Cruise from Risky Business a little too much in this film, for my personal choice. For me, too, having just a bit of an autistic brain for seeing things, the sets were heavily reused in a single sequence because New York City was built inside of a studio. And so you'll find this mailbox with this very specific graffiti on it that is then carried from one scene to the other. So you'll see Tom Cruise walk in New York, and this mailbox keeps showing up in every scene as if it's chasing him down the street. For me, that was very un-Stanley, to not notice that, hey, why don't we rotate that mailbox at least to the other side so that we don't see that very pronounced symbol. And maybe I should look at the symbol. Maybe it has some value to it. So Stanley passes. It's a bit of a mystery what happened. Spielberg then releases AI, which sort of definitely feels like a movie that has been stitched together from various concepts. It's definitely got its beautiful moments. The aliens at the end of AI were a remnant of what Stanley was trying to do in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And without ruining it for everyone, there's definitely a scene at the end of 2001 where a character is walking through a dwelling and there's noises in the background. These amazing, bizarre noises which yearn to the alien race that might have built the monolith within the movie. His goal was to actually craft an alien character, an alien body that would show up in the movie, but no matter what they did, it just didn't read right. Stanley needed CG to get that right. And so a lot of the designs were said to have been Stanley approved in AI at the very end, and that would have been, there's someone that commented that he said that it would have been nice to have these aliens at the end of 2001. So if you ever want to kind of meld those two things together in your head and get an idea of perhaps what he might have desired at the end of 2001, go see AI's up to the point of the finale. Now let's talk about how he made films, because it's very interesting. And the wisdom that he exuded in figuring this out organically, I think, calls to his brilliance. But before we get into that, I want to say one thing about, in talking to his daughter about some of these conspiratorial things and other things, she said, look, I think my father just had this intuitive mind. He just, when he has to make a decision, he has so gathered up the information in the weeks and years prior to having to make that decision, and his previous experience is never forgotten. It's always in the forefront of his mind, and he's built on top of his own shoulders, that the decisions he ends up making ends up being the right decision to capture the right scene, the right drama, the right metaphor that he's trying to put through. So I was told that probably 3 years ago, and then in doing research for this for this episode, that's exactly what he said at one point. Because they drilled him once, and he said, I really think I really just go with the flow, and it just seems to work out. But again, luck is hard work. So if you want to say he got lucky with his decisions, it's because the hard work precedes it. It wouldn't be uncommon for Stanley to work 10 years researching a particular concept prior to making the film. He was notorious. He wanted to make a Napoleon film at one point. And he traveled the world to see everything Napoleon had ever touched. He read every single book he could get his hands on that was a reputable book about Napoleon. Trying to figure out who that guy was, trying to get the subatomic character of his nature, so that if ever portrayed on film, we would actually understand Napoleon better. And I think it's very interesting that he would choose not to make a film. I mean, it's just the integrity, because Stanley could have always called a studio and got a film made. Guarantee it. Maybe at times the budget would be exactly what he wanted, but he had enough money to bankroll his own stuff if he needed to. But I've watched many of it because of Cinema Tyler. But I've read interviews about the actors that ended up getting to act with him. And, there's consummate professionals like Jack Nicholson who just got it and just flowed with it. Stanley was notorious for taking multiple shots, multiple takes of a particular shot in the script. And this was very strategic. It wasn't always because the actor did a bad job, although that definitely would happen. But what he wanted to do, and this is something that you can apply to your own life, especially if you're a creative person looking for a concept, you need to exhaust what you came to the canvas wanting to do. And then when you're absolutely exhausted, whatever is supposed to come out of you then flows through you. Because the blockage is your preconceived notions of what you were going to do on the canvas. Sometimes that works out, but a lot of times it doesn't. And so what Stanley would do is that especially by Full Metal Jacket, where I heard him talk about it the most, and especially the actors that lamented after the fact, they said, look, he would come to us and say, he would rarely ever give us, if ever, I think, in fact, some actors said he absolutely does not give out any advice on how to behave for your role. He lets you practice, and then you bring your performance. But what he knows is that when the actor's coming on to the set to film, they have this preconceived notion of how they're going to be this character. Now, maybe in a Jack Nicholson case, you have such a thespian that we can roll with it, especially Dr. Strangelove, all the legendary actors, right? But by doing several takes, he gets you to forget what you thought you were going to do. And it's super duper important. Because then what happens is the actors start living together in their scenes naturally. And it's at the point where a little ad-libbing can happen to get from point A to point B in the script. And there was a section of the Cinema Tyler analysis of 2001, which I'm going to share, I guess a tiny spoiler if you haven't seen the film, but there's some dialogue that had to happen in a pod, the one that turns around the beginning of this show, right? And the two actors are trying to secure themselves away from HAL 9000 so he can't hear them because they're worried about his behavior. And the dialogue is about them potentially shutting HAL down, if that's even possible, to make sure that they don't die here in space. So they lock themselves in the pod, they turn off the audio, the microphone, and then they ask HAL to rotate the pod. And they yell at him, and they yell at him to make sure that he can't hear them. And what ends up happening is, in the movie, HAL eventually is trying to figure out what the hell they're saying. He can see them through the window, but he can't hear them because they've turned off the mic. And HAL ends up reading their lips. And the way that supposedly came out is the character playing Frank had dozens and dozens of takes in this thing, and Stanley just didn't like the way it was coming out. It didn't seem natural. And so finally, the Frank character said, the actor said, this whole scene sucks. I don't even know why we're doing this scene. Apparently it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this is a big production, okay? So, you have to pay everybody's salary, even if you shut down production, right? So Stan Lee, they said, looks out from the camera at this actor after he lips off in front of everybody that the scene sucks, this is stupid, basically insulting Stan Lee in one way or another, right? And so Stan Lee then tells everybody, okay, why don't we just close down production for today? 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all right? So now the actor's like, oh my God, I just got fired. They're going to reshoot all the scenes I've been in. Now, of course, that was going to be a very expensive choice for Stan Lee. But that's not what happened. Stan Lee then tells the actor, why don't you come to my office after a break or whatever? And of course, the guy's thinking, I'm just going to get chewed out and fired. So Stan Lee then says, what the hell's, what's wrong with the scene? And, he talks about the dialogue. He just basically says, I just think this is stupid. And apparently, the lip syncing thing hadn't been figured out yet, which I find hard to believe. But the way that it's the character who played Dave, the actor who played Dave, was telling this story in a special. And he says that, I don't know, maybe he reads our lips, And Stan Lee was like, oh my God, that's utterly brilliant. So he calls Arthur C. Clarke in like Sri Lanka or something and says, what do you think about this? And he's like, oh, that's just crazy. And then Arthur C. Clarke said, he did a separate interview, at least sitting in Sri Lanka, goes, yeah, I told Stan Lee it was crazy. And he goes, I was wrong. He goes, computers could probably do that nowadays. The rumors of him shooting scenes, and I think the highest one I ever heard was about just shy of 170 shots for one scene, was that he was just breaking down the preconceived notions, like I said. Now, there was I actually misquoted Scatman Crothers' age in a previous episode. I thought he was older than he was when he was making The Shining. I think he died around 86, 88, and that was towards the late 80s. But he was at a point in his life where, just like James Cagney, he was having trouble remembering his lines. And so in one situation, they just kept feeding him the line. He'd say the line. Of course, he just nails the performance 100%. And so that was the only exception that I'm aware of. But now, his daughter Vivian made a documentary, which you can see if you buy the DVD of The Shining. You can probably see it online nowadays. But she walked around the set and starting the making of The Shining. She even followed Jack from his apartment, brushing his teeth, down to the set and getting ready for, I think, the axe shot, against the door. But she cross-stitched over some dialogue from her father, which in so many ways, he basically said, look, people think that it's easy to tell stories. And he goes, it's easy to film a story in front of a camera. But he said the tough part is making it interesting. And I think that is such a subtle little phrase that a lot of directors miss out on, especially seeing the either formulaic films of today or some of the B-movies that have been made over the last century. The reason why B-movies are called B-movies is that they lack the elements of good filmmaking. They might have great actors. Jack Palance made a ton of B-movies, okay. When it's written badly, it cannot be acted properly, and it cannot be rescued in edit. And so a lot of times, Stan Lee wrote a giant portion of all the scripts. You'll see in the making of The Shining, him in the kitchen on a typewriter, just with his fingertips, pounding out new lines for that day. And then they were printed on different colored paper, because every actor has to know what day they're on. So they're on a pink day, or they're on a blue day, or a blue hour, or yellow hour. They know if they got the wrong color, they throw those papers away, right? Something that Jack explained to, I think, Kubrick's mother. Now, we all know that any human being that lives their life in a constant state of attempted perfection, because it's up to them to find, they are never satisfied with the level of perfection that they achieve. There's always something else that they would change. And it's only when released and the public figures it out and appreciates it the way that the artist meant the art to be appreciated that they realize, well, at least I got it to a critical mass situation where I feel comfortable with what I did. I think Stanley ended up always achieving that landmark in his life. Of course, he passed before the debut of Eyes Wide Shut, so we have to assume that he was very proud of his work. But we, as citizens living a normal life, see a man like that, and it blows us away that anyone would have that level of perfection. Of course, this is also giving credit to everybody who worked with him, and he ended up building a staff in the UK by the 60s because he really sort of despised where America was going. And he's born and raised in America, right? He also liked the union-free capabilities of the UK because he could get behind a camera, he could control the lens, he could do things that the union says only a cinematographer can do. He had cinematographers, but he also participated in capturing these shots. The element of his filmmaking that I didn't appreciate until I started doing hardcore 3D, which is you will see countless documentaries of Stanley, and he's always got a lens around his neck, which is a very cliche thing for directors to have. But for Stanley, if you understand lenses, and I'll just tell you how this works so you'll understand the brilliance of what he was doing. A fairly normal view through a lens is a 50mm lens. And it's not a very wide angle lens. It's just straight ahead, straight shot of reality. Most cameras have generally about a 50mm lens, if they're not trying to do a panorama or something like a GoPro or something. The smaller you make the millimeters in a lens, the more wide angle features that you get. Under 30mm, you start getting a fisheye effect where the walls start to distort. So if you were to shoot a room with a 15mm lens, you have to keep the camera level to the ground to make sure that I-beams and wall structures look straight up and down, because if you tilt it in any way, shape, or form, you're going to get the walls wrapping, and it's going to look really strange. Now, he did that too, on purpose. But when you go back and rewatch his films, at least from 2001 and up, I think with Dr. Strangelove, he kept it pretty straight. And especially The Shining, when he gets on the ground and films straight up, which he actually initially did in Clockwork Orange with Alex in the bathtub and the old man on the other side of the door. He is giving you perspectives of reality that you have never seen in your life. And so his choice of lenses and the millimeter wide to tight shots that he chose were, in a cinematographer realm, the basic school for all cinematographers to come. And Stan Lee was so appreciated by the greatest directors. And I will say that any director that doesn't appreciate Stan Lee, they don't have to, okay? But if they didn't, then their films look nothing like his films. But the ones that are legendary, like Ridley Scott, was obsessed with understanding how Stan Lee did things. And if you know Turkel, who played Lloyd as the bartender in The Shining, who ended up being Dr. Tyrell in the Blade Runner series, or the first movie, I should say, first and only real movie, Ridley was asking Turkel, what would Stanley do? What would Stanley do? He kept asking. And Ridley was also very, very known for shooting tons of retakes to get the right scene. It was said that the only one of the only single takes that ever happened in Ridley Scott's life was the bartender shot when he was, or the guy that owned the bar in Blade Runner talking to Harrison Ford about whether or not he'd seen the girl in the photograph. That was a single take, and the cast, well, sorry, the crew was absolutely blown away that Ridley said, okay, that's good, because that guy wasn't even an actor. That guy was an owner of a local bar, and he was just pulled in as an actor, and he nails it in his first shot. Now, I think that the guy's eyeballs wander a little bit during that shot. It's a little weird, so it looks like a first take shot to me. But the other thing that sort of goes without saying in a lot of analyses of his career is just looking at Stanley's face when he's on set. And he was a fun-loving, normal guy from everything I've ever heard. He was a man's man, for sure, for various reasons. But when he was on set, you could just see an intensity of what he was filming. And in being involved at various levels myself, the way I sort of see that intensity in his face, because there's so many pictures of him. There's even some movie footage of him for Full Metal Jacket and, of course, The Shining, is that he is seeing this film and he's editing it in his mind. We always give Tesla credit for being able to build machines in his head and age ball bearings for 2 years in his mind to see if it's the right ball bearing. Stanley was the Tesla of filmmaking, in my opinion. And it's that intensity that if you surround yourself with these masters and you study them, Stanley is an anomaly of filmmaking that should infect every fabric of your being if you can get into the sort of subtextual moments that he was actually filmed conducting. I mean, when people took pictures of him. If you look in his face, there's just, I don't know what it is about certain eyes. You can tell the intensity in a person, and you can usually tell the intelligence in a person by looking at them. If you're unable to hear their voice speak and how they construct thoughts in their mind, right? When you see a film, especially as a layman, you're seeing, the credits roll. There's like half a dozen that roll before the film starts, and then there's usually several hundred that roll afterwards. And I think what the directors actually do today is potentially marginal compared to what you had to do back in the day when he was making films. There was an enormous pressure on your shoulders. And there's still directors today that film just like he does, where they do take on the burden of keeping it all together because they don't delegate out the decision-making process. They delegate out the production process. But they must make it to the spec of the director. Otherwise, it's not going to make it into the film. For me, Stanley is the epitome of a human being living in an envelope of utter perfection, pushing himself and pushing himself. And, I've done a tremendous amount of creative projects in my life in all different genres of creativity. And I will say that I am yet to do a single production that would remotely echo the investment that he put in probably his fastest film he ever made, which in my estimation, and no one really knows when he might have picked up the book for Clockwork Orange, but between 2001 and Clockwork Orange was a very short period of time for him. And in fact, even Barry Lyndon was a very short period of time for such a massive production. So those are probably the two fastest films he ended up creating. And they're masterpieces. It has been said several times that his estate, which he owns, his wife lives in that house now, is utterly packed with, has several rooms in this home, and it's just utterly packed with research, tons of clips that were filmed and not used. One of the most famous, bizarre things that happened was the original ending of Blade Runner is the way that you see it today, in terms of where Ridley Scott wanted to end the film, which is Deckard getting into the elevator and the door shutting. That was the original ending. And when he showed it to the studio executives, they said, "Man, this ending sucks. You need to give us an uptick at the end that everything's going to be okay." And so Ridley's like, "What are you talking about? It's perfect." They made him put a narration on the original film. So Harrison Ford narrates the beginning of the film, something that wasn't intended. And then there's a narration at the end, which wasn't intended. But he is stuck. He's closed down production. He's moving on to, I believe, Legend with Tom Cruise. Ridley is. And somehow he contacts Kubrick and he says, I need some film footage of mountains, because I got this idea about Deckard and Rachel driving off together at the end of this film, to satisfy the executives. And he goes, "I heard that you shot a lot of footage, B-roll, in creating The Shining." And sure enough, the story goes is that Kubrick's wife oversaw the B-roll filming in the Colorado hills. And so he's like, yeah, I got about 30 feet of film that you can have. So he ships this canister to Ridley Scott, and that became the finale of Blade Runner, where they shot both in the car, which could be shot anywhere, and then this outside footage where I don't know how, I can't remember, they must not have had the car, because the car was this futuristic car that Sid Mead designed, and they stitched that together. So there was an interesting reveal that Kubrick had, tons of stuff. And of course, why wouldn't you? Now, just a little piece of trivia. At the end of 2001, Stanley is rumored to have had all of the props of 2001 destroyed because he watched films like Forbidden Planet, made in 1956, with Leslie Nielsen and company. The props from that film got reused in at least a dozen Twilight Zones, a couple movies, and he was like, man, I don't want my stuff appearing in other people's movies, so he had supposedly a bunch of it destroyed. Until you go to the Kubrick exhibit that travels around, which I highly recommend if it's in your city. I would drive a couple hours to see it if I were you. You find out a bunch of the props were actually saved. And just recently, someone found the wheel prop in an old man's backyard, and it was filmed. So some things about him aren't true, but he lived a very private life, and it was mainly because of the fact that when he attempted to talk to the press in the 60s, whatever he said could be misconstrued. So he learned that if you sit in the room with press, they can write anything they want after they talk to you. But if you never ever sit with them, they can't claim they ever heard you say anything, and therefore if they printed anything, he had legal recourse to say, get that off your publication because I have nothing to do with that. I think that's pretty cool. And of course, Prince did the same thing until about the 90s when he started talking to folks. So if you ever find yourself extremely famous and you don't want to run into problems, don't ever talk to the press ever. But of course, they now chase you around wherever you go. So Stanley was a huge influence to me. I was blessed to have a father that at least showed me 2001 extremely early. He showed me Clockwork Orange very early. Never played Barry Lyndon to my knowledge. And of course, The Shining was an heirloom. Full Metal Jacket was an heirloom. And I was in California during Eyes Wide Shut. But the interesting thing about Eyes Wide Shut for me personally was that I was asleep completely to the way the world worked at those levels when I saw it. So for me, it was kind of a kooky movie. And later when I figured out, oh my gosh, this was actually quoting portraying some metaphor of what actually goes on in those circles, definitely made the hair on the back of your neck go up. And what's interesting about it is now that Eyes Wide Shut's been out there for a long time, it's now a catchphrase for people. You have your eyes wide shut. They're open, but you're not seeing what's right in front of your face. I think that's an interesting insight to how he perceives society to be going. Now, what he meant by that film, it's only our speculation, unless someone can credibly discuss a conversation they might have had with him about it. But anyway, that is the final episode of this season officially. We'll obviously continue bonus content until summer. Season 7 will just come out probably somewhere in late summer, early fall this year. So again, we'll be cranking out episodes in the meantime. This may not be the very last episode filmed at this location, but it will be one of the few final episodes filmed at this location. The weather is incredible today. It's almost 80 degrees. So I thought I wanted to film this during the day for whatever reason. And I've been saving that cigar for a month. So let me know what you think about Stanley, how you first discovered him. What was your first movie that you ever saw, and how did it affect you? And what was your opinion of Eyes Wide Shut in terms of its cinematic quality? Because if you believe it's one of his best films he ever made, I would love to hear you lament a little bit about why you believe that. Again, for me, Nicole Kidman and Cruise was disruptive to my mind for a normal Kubrick film. I don't know who I would have cast in those scenarios, but when Stanley finds an actor that is up and coming, he has an eye for that magic, and not a lot of directors do. But I mean, if Stanley Kubrick were to have collected rookie cards of baseball players, for instance, you should buy every card that he buys, because he's going to pick the winners. It's just incredible. And if you want to imbue yourself with an example of utter human perfection in a particular art, so I'm not saying this guy in a personal sense was perfect, because I don't know him at all in that realm, but if you just want to see the meticulous nature, and of course he had help, of course, but from Clockwork Orange up, he was unbelievably in control of his productions without a lot of outside influence. And he picked the people to advise him, and he picked the people to be his actors, and he kept the same team of filmmakers with him. The same people held the lights and rewrote the scripts and controlled, in addition to his own guidance, how the camera worked. And they respected him for that. And I think it's a very interesting thing for Hollywood and the unions, that they don't have the intelligence to recognize the fact that when you do allow someone to have control like that, if they're so talented they can do it, that you get a better product a lot of times. And so this whole union-based role system within Hollywood actually has probably destroyed films at times, where you have a person who's hired on board, and for whatever reason they're very talented in one genre, but they can't seem to film this other genre, but because the director has to surrender the role due to unions, you don't get the best of the best. And one of the other sort of sideline examples, metaphorically, is the artist Prince. When he made music, because he was writing and performing all of the instruments, if, for instance, the bass didn't belong in the song, but there's a bass player in the band, he didn't worry about that bass player not playing for that particular song. He's like, it sounds better without the bass. And so he did the right thing instead of the union-based methodology. And so when you do pull together a team to put this together, if you want to get into filmmaking or you're already in it, it's just something to consider. Something to consider. But anyway, if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. We have everything there: audio, video, social media. All new remastered season 1, a store. And for those of you who participate and donate on PayPal and Patreon, thank you so much. You make everything happen. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.